All right, so we'll call the special meeting of the Economic Development Commission Project Review Committee Subcommittee to order. It's 5:32 here on Monday, the 8th. I guess before we get started, is there any public comment? I don't believe we have anybody here from the public, so we'll move on to our main topic for the special meeting, which is the proposed regulations for the multifamily housing plan for Mansfield here. And normally when we have these reviews and we have these little meetings to kind of discuss our position, I don't know about you guys, but I have a pretty clear opinion on how I think we should respond. But I'll be honest, this one has me scratching my head because it's so complicated and the regs are just challenging. So I don't know if anyone else has a suggestion, or we just kind of dive into it and throw out some ideas, but this one's very complicated.
It is very complicated, and during the council meeting, I made the suggestion of extending moratorium to see the original reason why I think in the past we discussed we wanted the moratorium to see if these places would fill up and how they would affect the community. So I'm still going along with the suggestion to extend the moratorium, and I don't know if that's something the zoning commission can do.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I know they have a lot of like state regs around extensions and what they have to do in order to get them. I think for something as complicated as this, you know, we found out about it. We were at our presentation a couple weeks back, and you know, I think Jennifer kind of alluded to it at the meeting. She's like, you know, if you're not a zoning nerd, this can be a little bit challenging, and I'm definitely not a zoning nerd, and it's definitely more than a little challenging. And I think kind of from my perspective, and I'd like to hear from everybody. So at some point we'll go around and have everybody kind of give their 2 cents. But from my perspective, as a Mansfield resident and someone who pays attention to this stuff, if we don't understand what we're zoning and how we're doing it, how do we expect someone who's not from around here to figure it out? And I think if we want people to develop in a certain way in our town, it needs to be really clear as to what we're asking or what we're hoping for. And this just seems murky, to say the least. Like, not only with the overlay and the floating zone, but also then all the different steps you have to go through in order to refine your product down. Like, you know, if you want to build a duplex or a 3-family, you know, that's not a major development, but you have to go through the same steps as a major development. And so if we're trying to get some of this smaller scale stuff, I think having all these layers of regulation and review and rules and all this kind of stuff, it raises the cost. Every time you add another one of these milestones or thresholds you have to meet, it comes with a cost of the developer. And I'm not saying we should eliminate all costs, but I think what's not being considered here is if you're building a duplex, and let's say the duplex is, you know, 2-3 bedrooms side by side, right? So it's a 6-bedroom, maybe 4-bath duplex. You know, that's not $1 million project. That's under $1 million. And then if you have hundreds of thousands of dollars of site work or permitting work to do that, I think that tips the balance away from a developer actually proceeding with that process. If you're doing, you know, a 400-unit apartment complex like across the street from my office here, like, you know, a few $100,000 or a couple $1 million worth of following these rules and regulations is a drop in the bucket. But what I'm concerned with is we're adding so many layers to what you have to do, so many hoops to jump through. We're ruling out all the small scale stuff, which I think is kind of what we're looking for at this point. We're not looking for major stuff that we've already approved. We're looking for smaller scale stuff, unless I'm not understanding correctly. I don't know how anybody would, if any of you guys have any response to any of that. Brian?
You know, what you say makes a good point. But do we even really know? we're in the beginnings of creating our next POCD, Plan of Conservation and Development, and we haven't done that yet. And we might be getting ahead of ourselves. That plan might, I would hope, would have a lot of community input and an idea of what the residents of this community really want. If they do want smaller stuff, simplified zoning regulations for smaller stuff, I think that might actually be noted in the POCD. So what I'm thinking still is extend the moratorium until the POCD is complete and we have the full input that we could possibly get from the residents.
Brian, are you on here twice? Did you log in twice?
I should have. Why? Is there something wrong?
There's two Brians. I'm just wondering who the other Brian is.
No, I'm not logged in twice.
I think it's Brian Lynch.
Oh, awesome. All right.
I think Brian. Other Brian.
Did anyone else have any thoughts about the presentation we had at our last meeting? Any thoughts about how we respond to that?
I think it's a lot. And I sort of feel like, let's see what all these other projects are gonna bring. I'm not really, like, just breathe for a second. That's my feeling, like, and I don't know if we can extend a moratorium, can we? Can a moratorium even be extended? There was, I mean, and if it's a private person like you or I or any of us, and to jump through all these hoops to build, like you said, Steve, it's very costly. Then who's going to even want to come to town? You know?
I think you're right, Nancy. Dwight, I saw you had your hand up there.
Well, just to, yeah, I mean, maybe speaking to the points about complexity, I mean, and I apologize, I didn't have a chance to go and look at these after the presentation. I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but I was traveling at the time. But you know, I got, you know, and again, you know, pardon my naivete, but you know, the way that I understood the lifting of these moratorium to be framed was that there was actually, you know, I don't know about the totality of the package, but at least part of it was about actually reducing some of the scrutiny in applications. I got the sense that, you know, that at least in some cases, you know, developers were having to do a lot of, you know, design and planning before they even got the kind of initial green light. And one of the features of these new regulations to actually give them kind of advance approval with a little bit less initial scrutiny. Did I misunderstand that?
I've watched the presentation 3 times, like the time that she gave it to us, the town council presentation, and I rewatched ours. And it's still not immediately clear to me how this whole thing works. I think you come in for a pre-meeting first, and how you convey that to everybody, I don't know. But they're supposed to come to town hall for a pre-meeting, and then they're encouraged to come before planning and zoning for like a workshopping kind of session. And then they have to submit for a master plan, and then they have a public hearing, and then there's something else, and then they go for their site plan. So it's a lot of steps. And as someone who's not in planning and zoning, like just someone who's in real estate, like I hear a lot of steps, and I think it's going to take a lot of money and it's going to take a lot of time. And I was talking to a developer last week about a piece of land they just bought. And he said, Steve, he said, honestly, this other, I'm not going to say who it was or what town it was, but this other town was a delight to deal with. He said their regs were super clear. And I knew that when I bought this piece of land, this is what I could do with it. And I knew how long it was going to take. I knew the rules I had to follow. I couldn't just do whatever I wanted. I had to follow, you know, the rules in terms of setbacks and lot size and all that kind of stuff. But he said there wasn't a question as to whether or not I could do what I wanted to do with my piece of land. Because I knew going into it that if I bought it, then I'd be able to do this with it. And there's value to the developer, but there's also value to the landowner in that, because if you have a piece of land in Mansfield and you want to sell it, you have no idea what you're going to get for it, because you have no idea what they're going to turn it into.
Right.
And so that complexity drastically affects your price, you know, what you can get for your land. And so you sort of have to assume highest density and price it for that, which again is pricing out all of the smaller guys, which again is what I think we as a town are shooting for. Where I think we had, my opinion, and it's just my opinion, I would love to hear from everybody else, but we had 1,200 units approved so far, and only 400 of them are under construction yet. And already everyone's like, whoa, we're not loving how close this is to the road. We're not loving how big it is in scale. We're not loving how in your face it is. So if that's our response as a town, why are we not focusing on saying, hey, we don't want stuff over a certain number of units. Hey, we don't want stuff this close to the road. We don't want stuff. It seems like we should be focusing on the feedback that we've received from our community, as opposed to rewriting the regs. And the way I understand it, this floating zone can go anywhere that has 5 acres or more, which, you know, there's not an infinite number of 5-acre pieces left in our town, but there's several hundred of them. And I think one of the big concerns that I have is if you buy, you know, your home next to a 5-acre piece of land, and you're like, oh, that's zoned RAR 90, that could be a house someday, but it will never be an apartment complex. You bought that knowing what the rules were, and now you're changing the rules, and potentially they could drop multiplex or whatever the term is for it on that 5-acre piece. And I don't know that that's in fitting with what we've talked about. To Brian's point before, in the current POCD, and what we as the EDC have been operating under as far as I've been around, is we're focused on development, mainly commercial, in 3 areas: the Southern Gateway, the Four Corners, and in the downtown. And so now this kind of seems like we're opening the door for more sprawl, which I don't really think is what we're kind of going for as a town. I think we're looking for, I don't know. I'm not sure that that's the right answer.
Well, just to quickly follow up, I mean, and I'm sure others have more informed opinions, so it's probably be the last thing I say. I mean, that all makes perfect sense to me. It wasn't clear to me from the presentation that what they're proposing are regulations that are that go much beyond what regulations are already in place. In other words, I'm not clear. It wasn't clear from the presentation that there was anything new from a regulatory standpoint that hadn't been there before, as far as the site plan, as far as getting the approvals, as far as the various layers of scrutiny and review. And again, you have the experience to tell me whether I'm totally wrong about that. But my impression, it was hard for me to tell where new regulation was being articulated there, as far as, you know, the possibility of development or not. Now, to the point about opening up any 5-acre parcel to high density, I completely agree with you. I'm deeply troubled by that, because every piece of conversation we've had around these issues in the town has revolved around where these things are happening, where this development is happening, how close is it to established neighborhoods, how is it affecting local traffic? I mean, all these issues. So yeah, I 100% agree with you on that front. So anyway, that's all from me.
I don't know if Lane, if you have the opportunity to comment, or Brian or Lucy. I know Lucy's there, so she might be out. If you guys have anything you want to add or kick in, Lucy, go ahead.
Not much more compared to what Dwight covered. I'm good.
Thanks, Brian.
I was waving to say hi, but also I agree with what Dwight was saying, where I actually wasn't at the last presentation. And right now I'm kind of going through the bullet points on the YouTube video. So I probably completely missed what the beginning of the presentation of what is this solving? Like, was there a big problem that this is the resolution to? Like, why? Why? Did they
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And I think a lot of it was the feedback that they got from having these 4 projects approved kind of in rapid succession. And then it was sort of one of those, oh, whoops, not whoops, I don't like to sound like whoops. Like, oh, maybe pause, right? Pause to evaluate, kind of like what Brian was saying at the beginning. Maybe we need to pause and reevaluate how much more of this we need. But I'm not sure that rewriting all the regs in this way is necessarily achieving that end. It's just changing the rules. And maybe we need to say, well, maybe our town doesn't need another 400 unit apartment complex. Maybe we need more clustered single family housing, or maybe we need duplexes. I mean, one of the things that has never been said, and maybe it hasn't, I've watched most of the meetings. No one ever talks about the fact that there's a natural rate of home ownership in the United States. Ours is much higher than most other countries in the world, but the natural rate of home ownership in the US is about 65%. So about 65% of people can deal with or want to deal with owning a home. And there's 35% of 35% of people that don't want to or can't. And so we can't just build single family houses, because there's certain people that don't want to own a house. They're not going to be here that long. They don't want the responsibility. I just had a client last week who said, you know what, I'm old enough now that I don't want to have to cut my grass and maintain my home anymore. I just want to move into a rental. And I think that's a very valid, very fair point that often gets ignored or not considered in this. We need rental properties for a lot of different people, and all we ever think about are the students. And so I think we need some more thought into how do we come up with rental properties that appeal to more different segments of the population. But you can't really deal with that until you satisfy that student demand, because until you have saturated however many students want to rent, they'll always pay more than anybody else, and they'll not sneak in, but they'll take over those rentals, because if you're renting a property, you want to get the most you can for your property. You don't want to take less than you can from somebody else most of the time.
So that's
but,
why.
Steve,
Proposed.
Steve, I guess the question is, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lizzie.
No, I was asking, so is that the reason why these regulations were proposed?
I think they're trying to change it to provide for more input and review of the design, was my interpretation.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, why all of a sudden this is coming about. All right, I'm done.
Steve, the question I had for you is that I get it with once you complete the supply for the students, or the demand, get ahead of the demand for the students, and we can address the others. But is that a sustainable, I'm sorry, is that a quenchable thirst? Like, is there a point that we say, hey, if we have X amount of apartments, then the student demand should be covered?
Well, there's not an infinite number of students, so I think at some level it's satisfied. I don't know what that level is, and I think that's kind of, to the point Brian made at the beginning of our meeting here, was we kind of have to see how it shakes out. I think the other piece that people aren't talking about or haven't looked into yet in the town level is the current condition of most of the rental apartment complexes around here. Most of them were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So they're 60 to 70 years old now, and they've been rented to students for 60 to 70 years, and they haven't been amazingly upgraded or maintained. So a lot of them are beat. A lot of houses that are that old are beat, and we need new stock. So I don't think what we've done so far has been a mistake. But I think my concern is all of these rules, these comprehensive rules that they're putting in, and all these designs and reviews and stretching this whole thing out, is going to end up discouraging the smaller stuff, which is what I think we're trying to encourage. I think if I'm understanding people that I talk to and the incentives around town hall, is we're not looking for these 400 unit apartment complexes, but if you have reviews and designs and submissions that are required, we have to hire all these different professionals to come up with all these different plans, and they all have to be set to such a detailed level that it all comes at a cost, and that cost is going to be borne disproportionately by the smaller projects. It's going to be a much higher percentage of the project than it is if you have, you know, a $200 million project.
Steve, you've talked about, and I think everyone knows about the plans that this committee came up with to facilitate, you know, small business launching in Mansfield. Could you imagine a similar pathway or set of guidelines that would help the developers of smaller units navigate these new waters?
Like, that's a really interesting idea, sort of like a permitting guide, but more of like a development guide. I think we have to understand it better first, but that's a fantastic idea, especially if we're trying to incentivize a certain type of it. Like, I think, and again, I keep going back to what Brian said, because I think there's a lot of truth to what he said. We have to kind of see how this plays out, but we need to kind of figure out in our plan of conservation development, or our vision for Mansfield 2040, or whatever they're going to call it. You know, what do we want to see, and then figure out a way to incentivize it, because you can't just force it into happening. There is a market, and you can build stuff, and if it's not what the market wants, it's not going to be well received. It's just going to sit there. And if there is a demand, the market will find a way to meet that demand. So, you know, part of it is determining, you know, where that demand lies. And I think a lot of that is seeing how these apartments are received once they get built.
I feel like, so like if there's a 5-acre parcel next to a community or next to residents, or they're not even residents, they're just other people that own properties that are student housing and whatnot, a regular UI, any of us don't have that kind of money to go and pay all those extra fees. And what's going to happen with the houses that are been rented to the students for 30 years? You know, so now I'm going to be living next to the house that's in disarray.
Yeah, and I would hope that a lot of this, and it's just a hope, but I would hope that a lot of this new construction that we're building in apartments is going to alleviate some of the pressure on neighborhoods. Lane,
Some of the neighborhoods are really bad, Steve. Like people that have lived there, and then they're living next to students. But I also blame the people in the town, because the people in town don't even pay attention to what the hell is going on. You know, all of a sudden they're like, oh, what's happening on 195? You know, what is being built there? Oh, I heard it was Yukon housing, and like, come on guys, like, do you not pay attention of what's happening?
yeah, I know the people in town hall know what's going on. I think a lot of our residents don't necessarily pay attention, and I have a hard time faulting people, because we all lead busy lives that have a lot of stuff going on. But you're right. I mean, you sort of take notice after the fact, and that at that point it's too late, right?
Right, it's way too late. Like, if you have a big problem, I mean, just some of the things that I see on social media. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's Yukon. Oh, it's that. Come on, guys. Like, this was not just, you know, a month review of an apartment complex, or the hub, or the, you know, the one behind me. That was years. That was 3 years. And wait until that starts being built, because that's gonna be, people will be up in arms about that.
I have a comment if I may. Along Nancy's lines, I think, first of all, the residents or citizens of this country are so preoccupied with work and family, and having two jobs and trying to make ends meet, are strapped for time, and find it very difficult to find the time and follow what we're saying tonight, very complex things. They actually are counting on their elected officials, which I'm one, their town administrators, inland wetlands agencies, planning and zoning department, to do the right thing. So we have a process of elected officials who, through zoning, allow certain things to happen or approve. Basically, the last POCD allowed or asked for more development, higher density housing, and that's what we ended up having. So it's hard to say. I have to take some responsibility here in trying to protect the ruralness of the town and not let the development get totally out of hand where we don't have any more open space. And that to get to the I guess you call floating zone. Jennifer tried to clarify that. It's very ambiguous, I must say. But I guess it gives the planning and zoning department the ability to decline almost any proposal, especially in the floating zone. So if somebody comes in and says, I got a 5-acre piece in an R90, it would be very difficult, according to what was said in the town council meeting, for someone to slap up a multiplex on that land, according to Jennifer in the meeting. Now, you would have to hope that your elected officials on the Planning and Zoning Commission would continue to honor that. I guess the ambiguity of that whole floating zone thing has a lot of people concerned. So there's also another issue that comes to light here, and that's the Cedar Swamp watershed area and the environmental concerns of that, and that's front and center up there on stand around the corners. That may not exist in other areas of town. Of course, we have to be aware of sensitive wetlands, and I think we might be losing sight of that, especially with some of the development on the Four Corners. So they're asking us, the elected officials, to look after them, and that's a very difficult spot to be in. Thank you.
Lane, I wasn't sure if you were trying to make a comment before I saw you come off mute, but we couldn't quite hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I was on the phone before and for some reason, like, nobody could hear me. I don't know if I was muted somewhere else, but I guess a couple things I would note. One, Dwight had been asking about changes in policy, and it sounded like one of the changes that they were going to make had to do with the affordable housing component of the zoning, so that you couldn't make a payment in lieu anymore. And I sort of understood her point about the town not being in the business of building affordable housing, but I don't know what effect that's going to have on anything.
I do.
Okay.
We'll never fix it. We don't, without fee in lieu, we'll never fix it. It's incredibly simple. But go ahead. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that was exactly the sort of insight I was looking for. I guess the only other one was I'd asked if these regulations that we were looking at had had come from somewhere. If we were, using someone's regulations that had already been adopted, and I didn't get the sense that that they had. So I felt like we were I don't know, more adopting things that were sort of untested, which made me a little uneasy.
Yeah, I know that they came from a consultant that they hired, Tyche Consultants. And I didn't get a sense for if this has been done before in other places. It may have been, but not in Connecticut. I know, and maybe Brian has a little more insight on this one, but I know at the town council meeting, there was a number of members of the public that spoke out against it. And one of them was another planner, but more on a regional level. He wasn't like a town planner, he was more of a regional planner who used to live in town. His parents still live in town, and he came back to town to speak at the meeting, and was kind of critical of these proposals. And one of the terms he threw out there was this very scattered or shotgun approach to zoning, especially with the idea of this floating zone. And he actually also talked about the idea of getting rid of the fee in lieu not being a good idea because the cost of construction is so high. You can't build your way out of it. And I think that was in a letter we had written to planning and zoning as the EDC a while back. If you look at how far beneath the 10% affordable units we are, if you do the math, we would have to more than double the size of our town in order to meet that 10% threshold. That right now it's 15% of whatever you build has to be affordable. And I don't know anybody, even the most like build kind of a person, that wants to see the size of our town double. And so if that strategy is never going to get us to where we need to be, then it has zero chance of being a successful strategy. I think you need to consider other strategies to get you to where you want to be. And so I don't think removing one of the tools, being fee in lieu, that could get you there is a good idea at all. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to people saying, "Oh, well, they should have just built them." Well, maybe, but we might be able to do more, have more of an impact with those funds than just having a few extra units in one of these apartment complexes and never attaining that 10% goal. Because to Nancy's point from earlier, I think probably people have said it, like, if you don't meet that 10% goal, you might have an apartment complex next door because the 1030G regulation says they can put affordable housing wherever they want. A developer can put affordable housing wherever they want and not have to listen to all of your zoning guidelines as long as it doesn't create a public health concern because the state wants to see more affordable housing. So if we're not worried about that, then I guess continue down the path. But if that's something that we're worried about as a town, and we want to see, development in certain areas, I think it's a bad strategy. And I don't think there's a way to sugarcoat it. I think it's a very bad strategy to get rid of fee in lieu because you can't build your way out of this. Sorry, Elaine, I meant to cut you off there.
No, I appreciate you making that point. That was my question. What effect was that going to have? And I think you answered it. I did understand that it sounded like part of the objection to the fee was that they weren't high enough. And so it seems to me that one approach might be just raising the fee as opposed to, throwing it out altogether. But
I would wholeheartedly support something like that. And I think there's a way somebody smarter than I could figure out what's a more appropriate fee. And I would imagine it has to do partially with the cost of construction, but probably more specifically with the future revenues that you're giving up as a developer if you're deed restricting some of your units. So if you could rent it theoretically for, just for round numbers, $1,000 a month, but with being deed restricted, you could only rent it for $900 a month. So you're giving up $100 a month of income in perpetuity. There's a way to figure out what that future stream of the present value of that future stream of cash flows. And I would imagine that's one of those considerations a developer would take into account when they're deciding, do I want to build those units or do I want to pay the fee in lieu? And And so maybe it's just as simple as talking to a couple of developers to see how they would approach it, and then come up with a fee in lieu that's more appropriate than our current one, you know, at a higher
Mhm.
level, but not one that's like, hey, let's just double it. Like, let's not do it arbitrary. Let's do some research and figure it out.
Thanks for discussing that. I have a few comments on that, and payment and fee in lieu and what the town receives and what we really should try to charge if we keep the payment in lieu. And what's the end game? It makes the town responsible for building affordable housing with the payment in lieu. Somehow we're using that money to create affordable housing, and looking at Eagleville on the Green and town involvement on that, and the cost of building a affordable unit is much higher than if you left that affordable unit in the complex, as far as I can see, if I try to use some sort of formula. And I think you make a good point where we have to figure out what the heck that formula is. What does a payment in lieu dollar equal in affordable housing on the other end, when the town is responsible for for using the payment in lieu as a municipality. So it's much more complicated than you're making it, Steve.
Yes and no. I don't think that, again, I don't think we build our way out of this. So I don't think it means the town gets into construction. I wouldn't be in support of that either. I don't think that's the job of our town. I think we should look at, just like we preserved Stearns Farm by buying the development rights to that farm, or the state, we got state grant money, whatever, to do that. Why can't we go out as a town and buy deed restricted units and pay landlords to deed restrict their units for the next 40 years and buy
Again,
that?
that's dollar for dollar. Is that
I don't know that it
easier
has to be dollar for dollar. I think if you went to some of these, you know, more struggling complexes, the ones that are a little bit further afield that maybe don't have full occupancy, or you wait until these new ones are built and the old ones that are all, you know, beaten up and need a lot of renovation, maybe at that point they're looking for funds to renovate, and you could say, hey, look, we'll use some of this fee in lieu money. We'll buy a deed restriction on your apartment complex, so it has to be deed restricted going forward. You can only rent it as affordable units. But we'll give you this chunk of money which you can use towards renovating your unit. And I think you'd find a lot of landlords that would be receptive to something like that, because you're basically paying them up front to be able to, so that they don't have to put more money into it themselves. And it serves both purposes. We get more deed restricted units, and they have the money to fix them up so they're in better shape. Then you're not building from the ground up. It's a lot cheaper.
sounds
And
sounds
the town's not in
good.
charge of it. Then it's still private people that have to run it. We don't have to deal with having more people of the town have to oversee it. It's just let the private market solve it.
You know, you buy out a deed restriction on a landlord sells the property or goes bankrupt, goes running, also they have a financial crisis, which is possible. I mean, it's a very complicated scenario what you're talking about. It needs to be studied closely. You know, I don't think we're really here as this committee in any position to say, hey, let's do this. It needs to be studied. I'm not in a position to say, oh yeah, let's get rid of the fee in lieu and or yeah, get rid of or reinstate the fee in lieu and then they take this Steve Ferrigno idea and say, yeah, let's go with it. It's too complicated. You know, it's what if, you know, honestly. I mean,
Yeah, I guess we'll have to
idea.
agree to disagree on that one. I'd rather have a complicated strategy that works than a non-complicated strategy that would never work.
We don't know that.
We know we can't build out of it, so we got to come up with a different idea. that's kind of where I'm coming from. But anyway.
Could I ask a question about that? I mean, the mandate for affordable housing is applies to every town in Connecticut. I mean,
Yeah.
how are other towns handling this? I mean, I tend to agree. I think it's, to me, I don't have an ideological opposition to the town getting involved in building, but practically that's very difficult to do. There's so many competing interests and so many viewpoints that have to be reconciled before something like that can happen. I'm just curious if you have any idea, Steve, or if anyone else here knows, how do other towns handle their shortage of affordable housing, which from what I understand is I mean, that's true to like every municipality in Connecticut. They're like everyone is short. And Mansfield is kind of distinguished for being not quite as short as most of the other ones. So how are other towns handling that, do you think?
I've only talked to one other person about it, a different developer, and he said they did it using tax credits, which I don't know that that's the right solution for our town. We don't have a very popular view on using tax credits around here. So, and I think personally, it sounds like a much more expensive route because tax credits are an annual thing, the way he was describing it. Whereas what I would envision would be something that would be more of a one-time fee. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that could be something that we could look into, or maybe the town should be looking into as well, as what are other towns doing to deal with it. But we have a lot of one-time, the way that I kind of envision this was, we have a lot of one-time income money. We have this fee in lieu from these apartment complexes that are getting built. And we're not going to have 4 or 5 more giant apartment complexes getting built because there's not that many more spots to do it, right? So it's not a reoccurring revenue source. At any rate, it's not going to happen every single year, right? So we wouldn't want to tie up income with a liability where the liability is reoccurring and the income is not. So I think the solution should be something that is a permanent solution, so we're not digging ourselves a bigger hole in the budget. It should be matched up to these one-time funds. But I think kind of the general gist of what I'm hearing from is maybe that's not the strategy, but the idea of getting rid of the fee in lieu is something that we're not necessarily supportive of. We think it needs more consideration. Is that a fair summary of where we're at as a committee here?
I would agree with that.
It's my assessment, yeah.
I agree.
We need to study this.
Sorry, I cut somebody off there.
No, just reaffirming my agreement with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So I've just been jotting some notes down, so we'll try to put something together here, but the notes that I have are, it sounds very complex. We're concerned about sprawl. We're concerned about the impact of the development that's already been approved but hasn't been constructed. And we're not fans necessarily of just eliminating fee in lieu. We think it needs more research and discussion. Is that a fair summary so far of the main points we've hit, or did I forget any?
Are we gonna mention anything about extension of the moratorium?
Extending the moratorium, thank you.
Steve, is there a timeline at all for when like say the hub got approved? Is there a timeline that they have to go and actually start their construction?
There is, and I'm not sure. I believe it's either 1 or 5 years. So I know there is a timeline, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. I believe it's 1 year in this revised version that they're proposing now. And there may be different timelines for different parts. Like, I'm not sure if like the water timeline is shorter than the construction timeline. Like if you didn't start it right away, if you'd have to go back to the water authority and ask for allotment again and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not exactly sure what that is, Nancy, but I know there is one.
that would be interesting to know because, you know, like all these other places have gotten approved, but there's no construction being started. So then when do we go back to square one or square three? You know?
Yeah, certainly.
I agree with you with the, you know, putting the affordable housing and giving the credits to the landlord, that kind of thing. But then again, what 75-year-old or that needs a place to live, an affordable place to live, wants to live next to the college kid?
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of, that in a nutshell is part of my concern with these regs is like, we don't want giant complexes because that doesn't suit our need. We have giant complexes. We want smaller scale stuff where you could have a duplex or a 3-family or something like that. But again, I'm concerned that it's so expensive to go through this process that you're not going to see any of that kind of development because it's expensive and people can't invest the time or the resources in doing it. And I think if you could, kind of like Dwight said, if you had like a development guide and you could streamline this out and say, hey, look, these are the steps you have to do so people can understand it, I think you'd actually see some of it. But the way it is now, I think it's just way too complicated for anyone that doesn't have an entire department you could, you know, have looking over this stuff.
May I weigh in
Yeah,
on
please.
that? So last week, I keep saying last week, I don't remember the exact date, but at our last meeting, you know, one of the questions I'd asked was about the town's legal options when it comes to restricting types of zoning based on different housing densities. And Tony Moran said that, I believe it was Tony who said that, you know, really, or perhaps it was the presenter who said that there had been some discussion with the town councilor and that was deemed, you know, pretty problematic to restrict along those lines. And so I just want to kind of comment that, you know, I think you're absolutely right, Steve, that, you know, and I've looked into this, and while that's sort of true and sort of not true, you know, it does seem like the path to improving single family home construction and some smaller developments, you know, duplexes, threeplexes, and so on, is through, you know, incentivization rather than mandates or obligations. And so I want to just kind of second that. I think that that's something that could actually appear in the EDC's response, right? That, you know, that we think that that these regulations, whatever they turn out to be, you know, should think about incentivizing these smaller scale developments. And you can do that through the regulatory process without, I think, running afoul of, you know, the constitutional protections that any private property owner has afforded to them. And so, you know, some of the things that we've mentioned is, you know, I think are definitely, you know, possibilities. One of the other ways that it seems to me as though you could kind of get to that end would be to scale the fees to some degree to reflect the size of the development. And I don't mean that simply from the standpoint of, well, if you've got, you know, 40 windows facing the street, you know, each of those windows is going to cost X amount of money for an architect to design. I don't mean that. I mean, obviously, there's a scaling issue that happens at every layer of a development. What I'm talking about is, you know, could these regulations have built into them incentivization structures within the fees associated with permitting and associated with different moments in the review process, so that if I want to build, you know, a duplex, that I'm held to an entirely different fee structure than if I want to put up a complex with 60 apartments. So I think that would, to some degree, like kind of address, I think, your very prudent concern that, you know, an elaborate, you know, regulatory apparatus is just defaulting to benefit the largest property owners the biggest paychecks or the biggest, deepest pockets out there. When in fact, what we would like to see in Mansfield is maybe some local property owners buying properties and building houses and, you know, kind of keeping, as it were, landlords from being absentee landlords, you know. So that might be one way to like think about how can you scale those fees to make it easier for people to enter into smaller scale development projects. And I think, you know, along the lines of the permitting guide kind of concept is that, you know, you could also like potentially have the town, and of course this all, you know, there's always labor costs involved and, you know, helping someone, you know, through these complex, you know, legal processes, you know, is not like an effortless thing. It can take many, many hours, but you could imagine that the town might consider appointing someone or reassigning duties for someone who's already working for the town to specifically work with, you know, private, small scale, LLC type organizations in ways that are different from when we're working with like, you know, Blackstone property management or whatever it is, you know, something like that. So anyway, those are just a couple of ways that I could see pushing the incentivization kind of angle of this a little bit.
And I think that that's a fantastic idea, by the way. And I think that fits with a lot of what they're trying to do, because one of the things that Jennifer mentioned repeatedly in her presentations is the reason they want to have that design review meeting is they want people who really understand the town of Mansfield. And maybe a different way I could articulate my concern is I think that with all these rules and regulations and all this stuff they're putting on top, you are excluding those people that you're actually trying to get to develop. The people who live here and the people who understand our area are the ones you want developing here, not these, you know, huge corporations that develop college housing all over the country. But those are only ones that have a legal team and an engineering team and all these people on staff that can afford to deal with all that kind of stuff. So yeah, a scalable fee structure or a scalable requirement, I think that's fantastic. And that will, yeah, great idea.
I do have a council meeting I gotta get ready for, so I
Yeah.
have to dismiss myself, or are we almost complete?
I think we're pretty much there because it's been about an hour. So in terms of next steps, I have a bunch of notes here. Is there anyone that would like to try to draft this letter? If not, I'll give it a shot and I will email it out to everybody for comments. So we can't reply all because that constitutes a meeting. So I will draft this and send it to Kathleen, and she'll email it out to all of us and then reply back to Kathleen with your comments. And then I'll try to incorporate them all into this letter. But I think our deadline for getting comments to up to the town is next Monday, the 15th. So we have basically this week to draft this response. So keep an eye out Wednesday, Thursday this week. And then if you can get me your comments, you know, over the weekend or whatever, but certainly the sooner the better, that'd be great. Any other thoughts, closing thoughts, words of wisdom? All right, great. Thank you everybody for coming tonight and for your participation. I really appreciate it. And we'll keep everybody posted as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion, so moved. Second?
So moved.
Second, all in
Aye.
favor? All right,
Aye.
thanks.
Yeah.
Great.